My apologies to you in advance. You'll note we had this morning, kicking it off, a world of opportunity. You had entrepreneurs, you had innovators. Now you have political leaders, statesmen, stateswomen. This is a world of uncertainty because the global order is not moving in a direction that many of us are comfortable. We look at the United States, the unilateralism, the level of indifference to a US-led global order, not started under Trump, but certainly has been accelerated under him. We've also heard from President Xi Jinping yesterday, from Vice President Wang Zhishan this morning, that the Chinese are now taking the lead on globalization and openness. Show of hands, how many people are committed and convinced that the Chinese are actually doing that? No one raises their hands. One person, we got one. So there's a lot to talk about. Let me start to this far end with my friend Kevin Rudd. Kevin, how worried are you? How uncertain is it? Let's look at the big elephant in the room, US-China.
Well, I think it all occurs, Ian, in the context of something you framed yourself a little while ago called G0. And I put it in that context, which is the world, including China, looks at the global order, traditional American leadership, and is now asking, is it a constant or is it now a fundamental variable? Now, I grew up in a generation where this was regarded as a constant. But when people look at the variable now, they see, I suppose, uncertainty arising from Syrian red lines back in the Obama administration, the US canning of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the assault on the World Trade Organization, the abandonment of the Human Rights Council, and then absenting the climate change negotiations from the Paris Treaty. And the world, including China, looks at that and says, this is different. This is actually new. And we do not know, including China, what America now internally actually believes is its future global role and regional role. On the China bit, which you asked about, and I'll conclude on this, the Chinese, as Dr. Kaye just said before, and a very wise and deep reflection, think of these things in a very long stretch of time. But their abiding view of the United States and the global order for some time has been the emergence of what they call, in their own language, a period of strategic opportunity. That is, the world's becoming more multipolar, there's more space for other players like China to be much more active, they sense a relative decline in American absolute power and in America's preparedness to use that power. And as a consequence, China therefore sees a vacuum, and nature, as we know, abhors a vacuum. But here's the last bit, I think, and why I think we're into a new uncertainty. And that is, in the last few years, but we see it manifest this year, all this is coming to a new head in the dynamics of the US-China relationship. And having just come from China myself, where I've been for the last 4 or 5 years, I think there is now a deep realization in Beijing that there is a fundamental shift in the American take on China. That they see China no longer as a status quo power, but changing the international realities, and in a manner which Washington no longer sees as being in its interests or compatible with its values. So we are now into a new terrain as of this year. The Americans have said it's the end of strategic engagement, the beginning of strategic competition. Some of the commentariat are describing it, I think, foolishly as a new Cold War. That's vastly premature. But we no longer have reliable rules of the game. And that's why we are now into, in the US-China relationship, a new world of uncertainty.
So, Secretary Jaishankar, you just heard Kevin talk about the fact that Chinese perceive that there's a new growing consensus in Washington. One of the few issues that there is a consensus on in Washington these days is that China's becoming more of a strategic competitor, for some a direct strategic threat. It's not only perceived that way, of course, in Washington. How does India fall into this equation?
Well, I think there'd be both pluses and minuses here. to some extent, if you look at some of the issues like market access, trade deficit issues, India has one of the largest trade deficits. I think after the US, we are probably the third or the fourth. And we have market access issues in China as well. We have, independent of the US, we have our own sets of issues with the Chinese. But including a border problem, the world's largest real estate dispute. But on the other hand, just so that we get the balance right, we also have an ability to work with the Chinese. So bear in mind, in a sense, if there's a rebalancing in the world today, if the premier world forum is no longer the G7, but the G20, China is responsible for it, and India has also benefited from it. So to some extent, the issue for us is there will be issues with China. There are, for us, political issues. There are security issues. We have Belt and Road concerns. But it's a sort of mixed picture, really. And for us, the challenge is how to get that balance right. And in a world where, to a large extent now, people are hedging on different relationships, I think it's important that while we are firm with the Chinese on issues that matter to them, we also are positive about issues on which we can work with the Chinese.
As India is getting bigger too, not just China, as we see the tensions over places like Sri Lanka, over the Maldives, is India starting to perceive these as more zero-sum with the Chinese? Do you think this is a future the two countries are heading?
Well, look, some of the issues in Sri Lanka and Maldives are connectivity issues. Now, we work with the Chinese in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We work with them on the New Development Bank. I think the Bangladesh foreign minister is here. He will tell you that we actually have a Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar connectivity initiative in the pipeline. But if I think if you don't make this consultative, if you don't make this transparent, if this is not based on commercial viability, then I think there will be strategic concerns. And in some of these places, that's exactly what we have seen. So to my mind, a large part of that challenge is actually to get them to sort of center more, to get them to understand that the rest of the world has concerns. And these are not, all concerns are not zero-sum games between the world and China. I think how to... because look, at the end of the day, the challenge is you are having the rise of a global power, which doesn't any longer fit into the rules of the game. I mean, that's really the bottom line.
Kawaguchi-san,
yes.
I mean, that's a dramatic way of putting it. The rise of a global power which doesn't fit within the rules of the game. I want to ask you about Prime Minister Abe's trip to Beijing, but first I want to ask, does that characterization of China one that you think the Japanese accepts?
Well, China is our next door neighbor. And Japan and China are the two largest trade partners. We have had a long history of bilateral relationship that went up and down, all these. It is important for Japan to have a good relationship with China. Actually, in 2008, then Prime Minister Fukuda and President Hu Jintao agreed on the use of the word mutually beneficial strategic relationship to describe our bilateral relationship. Ever since then, our relationship went very bad. So we have been, for the past over 10 years' time, we have been trying to rebuild, make our bilateral relationship to the level where we agreed in 2008. And then we had exchanges of views, and so Prime Minister Abe is there to basically restore the relationship where we were. And also, in addition to that, since Japan in 2008 was the largest GDP producer, was the second largest GDP producer and China was number 3. There are issues that did not exist in 2008, so we added that. So we are basically being realistic about China.
So that trip by Prime Minister Abe to Beijing with a lot of CEOs and was reported very widely as very successful, not something that many of us would have expected from Abe when he started as Prime Minister. Is this a sign of Japan hedging a little bit?
Well, Prime Minister Abe takes business people when he goes to Russia, to India, and other countries. So that's nothing new. If I said we are not hedging, then probably I am not telling the truth. But if I said we are hedging, that's not true either. The point is that we are being realistic and future-oriented. That's all.
Luis, does China's trajectory feel sustainable on the ground in Latin America today? Good, bad, and indifferent?
Look, first of all, if you go back, say, 20 years, trade with China and Latin America was almost inexistent. Yeah. Today, it's about 16% of total trade of Latin America. Much of that trade is concentrated in South America and is concentrated on a handful of commodities, from oil to soybeans to copper and iron ore, because we're largely, not unlike Australia, basically commodity producers. But the other phase of this has been that China has significantly ramped up its amount of both investment and financing into Latin America. Take, for instance, last year, there were more Chinese investments into Brazil than, say, the United States. But yet, if you look at trade between Latin America and the United States, we're about 26% of total U.S. trade, of which about 50% of that is around NAFTA and Mexico. So there's still a huge amount of trade that is happening between the United States and Latin America, notwithstanding that today, countries like Brazil or Argentina or Peru or Chile, the number one trading partner is China. So it's been a profound change, and I think the phase of the change is happening in the more that they're doing financing into Latin America and they're doing investment.
We just have a new president in Brazil, Mr. Bolsonaro, who ran in part by saying that China was trying to buy Brazil, and he was going to push back. Do you expect to see an awful lot more of that kind of sentiment on the ground across South America with China's footprint expanding? And secondly, do you think Brazil's actually in any way going to change its policies towards China?
Look, I think it's too early to say. I think the new president of Brazil is putting together a very strong economic team. I think it's going to be good for the markets. He recently appointed the main judge who did all of the anti-corruption challenge that Brazil had, and that was part of the reason a lot of Brazilians voted for him in terms of cleaning up the corruption issues. So in terms of how is that going to play out with China and Brazil, I think I saw recently was meeting with the Chinese ambassador. I think those things will moderate more, is my impression. And we have to see. It's an unknown quantity, but somebody who got a very strong mandate from the Brazilian people.
Kevin, as the person here who spends the most time on China, if you were advising the Chinese now, what would you tell them to do that could help in the next few months diffuse what appears to be a situation that's heading for more confrontation, particularly with the Americans?
I think on the questions at present, all roads lead to the economy. And if you're looking for a curious area of common ground between the United States and China at present, it's potentially on this. In China right now, there is a very large debate about the future of the private sector. You see it manifest right across the country. A debate about too much control by state-owned enterprises relative to private firms. An attitude and a criticism of the role of state-owned financial institutions not providing market-based credit solutions for private firms. You also see other debates about the level playing field between the two, competitive neutrality. And in fact, what we've seen during 2018, I think, is the emergence of a low-level strike by Chinese private investors investing in their own future capital expansion because they are suffering a lack of confidence about their own future. Now, parallel that with external American critiques of what is going wrong in terms of American market access and competitive neutrality, with American firms and international firms accessing the Chinese market, either in the trade sector or, frankly, in investment and even in technology. There are parallels, therefore, between the external complaint by the US and others about Chinese forms of protectionism and the emerging internal complaint by Chinese private firms who generate practically all the new employment in China. These are not marginal players. So therefore, if we had Wang Qishan with us right now, and I'm sure Fireman Wang, as he's known in China, and that is he's always brought in to put out a fire here or there, an extraordinary experienced statesman. I think some of the magic at present lies in China accepting the legitimacy of some of the external critique of its level of effective and substantive market opening, both the traded sector and the capital sector. And secondly, therefore, unleashing what is also the legitimate internal constraints and complaints from its own private sector. If you do that, you would actually diffuse much of what is now bubbling up, both internally in China and externally in the relationship with the United States.
Do you think there are more opportunities for India in a world in 5 or 10 years that looks more bipolar, that looks more multipolar, or that looks more like a reversion to the order and the institutions that we've been living with?
Well, look, before I give you a straight, simple answer to that, because the first question was on China, I think I need to sort of complete the picture here. Yes, there are problems coming out of China's rise, but there are also problems coming out of the Western reaction to China's rise and the Western reaction to what's happening in the world. I mean, if you look at what's happening, not just in the US, but Europe as well, you have really 3 big issues: global supply chains, global mobility, and what is fair economics. So put IPR, trade, everything in that. Now, the rebalancing that I spoke to you about, I think that has created a very deep social, political unease in the Western world. It's visible not just in Trump's election, but in Brexit and in some of the far-right, more nationalistic politics of Europe as well. So when we look out at the next 5 years, as you said, we are actually looking at what is at least a kind of medium-term turbulence. Because if these are 3 big issues, supply chains, mobility, and what are the rules of the game? Because, again, China may have some issues with the rules of the game, but China is not the only country which has issues with the rules of the game. So the West also has issues with the rules of the game, and the West is not winning. So I think we are looking actually at a far more turbulent world, a more unsettled world. And for a country like India, which in one way, we are a liberal democracy, we are a market economy, we are a pluralistic society, so we are able to bond with the old order, if you would. At the same time, we are an Asian society. I think Wang Qishan reminded us today that those who have I don't remember his exact words, but actually those who have a great past also will have a great future. So, which applies to us as well. So my point is that in some ways we have that ability to bridge this divide. to make the most of it. I'm not suggesting a rollout here, but I would certainly say that the playing field has sort of become looser. It's more unstructured. So if one thinks one's way through, you do the right things, you make the right bets on the right issues with the right players at the right time, I think it looks moderately bullish.
The question of the rules of the road is an important one and a common one that I think we're all thinking about right now. Luis, I want to ask you, we've got these new nascent institutions that are being created by China, Belt and Road, AIB, a lot of money behind it. Is that making you up your game at the IDB? How is it changing the way you think about your organization's governance, the future, the opportunities, the challenges?
Look, it's very easy to talk about new institutions. It's very difficult to have new institutions working. And what I've seen both with the New Development Bank and with the AIB is, first of all, we've been working very closely with them and trying to find ways to cooperate. There's a lot that they have learned from us, and there's a lot of flexibility that they have, the way they have been founded in ways, in their governance, for instance. There's a lot of flexibility that they have. They have more easy ways of approving loans, of doing things like that. But all in all, I think there's, the development space is so big, there's plenty of space for cooperation. And both the New Development Bank and the AIB were founded with a lot of the principles that most countries subscribe to, which are not unlike the ones that we have done. Which means essentially that we have to, I think all in all, yes, we always have to up our game regardless, but at the same time, I think it's good to cooperate with them.
But concretely, I mean, in terms of the way that your employees are thinking about kind of the strategy of your organization, has it changed in any way in reaction to what we've seen from China?
Well, initially, with all the headlines, people thought, oh my goodness, what's going to happen here? And then soon you discover that, what matters is the relationship with your clients, the way you develop projects. I mean, that level of expertise on the ground, you cannot replace overnight. And so that gives you an in that they will take a long time before they can fill.
Japan is one country so interesting because, on the one hand, incredibly stable, incredibly resilient, best infrastructure in the world. On the other hand, foreign policy that's been necessary, and military policy that's been necessarily very constrained post-war. In an environment where the rules of the road are up for grabs, and where the U.S.-Japan relationship is a little less certain, how much more do you think we can expect, realistically, from Japan in creating a more holistic, maybe even assertive foreign policy?
Two things. One is that you said the U.S.-Japan relationship is becoming a bit unstable.
I said maybe.
Maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think so. This is the U.S. calls it the cornerstone of alliance, and for us it's the very basis of our existence. So it is very important, and we will be thinking that it is the most important thing for Japan. The second thing...
Did Abe tell Xi Jinping that when he was in Beijing last week? Just kind of...
Well, the second thing was that Japan has been constructive already. If you think of the international trading system, Japan led the TPP-11, which will be effective end of this year. And we are also leading the negotiations of RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Agreement, economic, or whatever the real name is. And that we are making our best efforts. That's ASEAN countries plus 6 in the region. Japan, China, and Korea have been talking about FTAs trilateral. And we have agreed on and that's been effective, on the investment treaty of the 3 countries. So we have been paying attention. We have been very constructive. And on the security front as well, we have revised. We are constrained by the Constitution. And we can do certain things in the security field. We cannot do certain things. So within that institute constraint of Article 9, we did try to change the interpretation a little bit. Now we can do more things than before. So we've been aware of the responsibility, and I think we've been acting accordingly.
Now, Kevin, in an environment where the rules of the road are changing, adapting, becoming a little looser, weaker, everyone talking about that, you're the one person on the panel here who's actually run a major advanced liberal democracy.
I'm still troubled by Jaishankar's observation that if you've had a brilliant past, you'll have a brilliant future. We've only had a convict past. So.
Indeed, your forebears, for example, yes.
Both sides, yeah.
Yeah, but I'm wondering in that, especially given that context, do you think there are any rules of the road that the leaders of today's advanced industrial democracies need to be prepared to compromise on?
I think on core questions of open economies, open politics, and open societies around which we've constructed this thing we call the liberal international rules-based order. It ain't perfect, but I've yet to see a better alternative. Therefore, that of itself, in my judgment, is worth countries not simply from the traditional West, but the range of new democracies around the world, capitalist democracies, to get behind as well. Where I think the place emerges for our Chinese friends who represent an authoritarian political structure is obviously their voice expressed through these institutions will be larger, as it should be. We've had the debate about the Chinese quota at the IMF and other global institutions, and I'm sure within the major development banks as well. If I could add one footnote to that, though, we'd be talking about the impact of China, for example, against the Inter-American Development Bank and other global institutions. One of the big debates in China right now is, not often articulated publicly, is where in China is all this cash going to come from to actually fund BRI, to fund the other great institutions which are being dreamt and conceived of. I mean, China at the end of the day is not just made of cash. If you do the sums on a $1, $2, $3 trillion investment program for BRI writ large, frankly, there's a debate from CIC, CDB, and the others in China saying, guys, you know, not all this is going to work. And when you start to see projects being sub-financial, let me tell you, there's a real debate going on. So what Lewis said before about after X decades of experience of the Inter-American Development Bank, or the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, you know, there's a fair bit of scar tissue on what works and what doesn't. China is about half a mile down this road at the moment, and it's a 100-mile road. And the experience so far is pretty rough. So before we assume the Chinese monolith is going to step in with all this cash to do all this stuff, it's going to be a much messier picture, in my judgment, than that.
It's a very good way to close. They're half a mile down the road, but they were going about 200 miles an hour, and we haven't seen the steering wheel yet. So, look, a short panel, but a fantastic panel. Would you please join me in expressing appreciation? Thank you very much.